I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Delano Squires.
I'm Inez.
I'm Emma Waters.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We've got a great roundup of topics today. Inez is going to kick us off with the Biden age issue and the latest round of gaslighting from the Biden White House and campaign. Emma is going to walk us through the latest court case involving Jack Phillips, the Masterpiece Cake Shop baker. I will go through a New York Times article that details how the Trump resistance, the anti-Trump resistance, is preparing for a potential second term of the former president. And Delano will close us out with his latest piece on the culture war and the collateral damage that might come with it. So with that, I will kick it over to Inez to get us started.
Great. This is something I think we've all observed. This is not some kind of inside the Beltway political baseball. We all know that Biden is showing his age. And that it's an issue for voters. So the last week or so has been kind of a parade of these sorts of incidents. First in the G7 summit, where he was wandering off sort of aimlessly to talk to a parachuter, has to be escorted back. You see Macron actually lean over to Giorgia Meloni and her pursue Biden and kind of escort him back and kind of pull, if you're on the video, you'll see what I'm doing with my hands, kind of pull him back towards the group of leaders. And then there was a fundraiser in LA with Barack Obama, among other Democratic stars. And there's a video of Obama basically escorting him off the stage like a toddler. This is in addition to reports after the G7 summit in European press and in British press, right? That all of the European leaders were very shocked by Biden's condition, that he's, quote, the worst he's ever been. So there's actually reporting in the UK and Europe about his inability to do the job, and the other leaders of the G7, their sort of reaction to him. Here in America, there is more of the gaslighting press, right? Where MSNBC and Washington Post and others have come out and said, basically, like, there's an explanation for each one of these things. He just wanted to talk to a parachuter, accusing Republicans and Trump of spreading misinformation about Joe Biden when this is all on video and very obvious for everyone to see. Really just going hard on what we saw after the Wall Street Journal article a few weeks ago. I talked to a lot of sources on background about Biden's decline. This sort of response from the media and from the Biden White House that is essentially angry, accusing anybody who notices these kinds of videos and gaffes as of essentially spreading misinformation and lying about Joe Biden, when this is something that's really obvious. And frankly, the polls bear it out. There are a large percentage, not just of Republicans, not just of independents, but a large percentage of Democrats are really concerned about Biden's age. And look, it's not fair. It's the way that things are. And so I don't know, just to toss it out to you guys at this point, do you think this is going to be a major factor in the election? First of all, and second of all, do you think this strategy is the best one, even if you were to put yourself in the Biden campaign's shoes, to continually deny the fact that, like, because it's not just one video, right, where you can kind of just say, oh, this is, it was a mistake, or like people are cutting it out of context or whatever. It just seems like at this point, and probably going forward, we're going to have these videos coming out every week, a couple times a week, right? Every time that Biden has to present himself and represent us in public. And so do you think that the total denial is actually the best strategy here? And can they continue to rely on the press to help them do that?
Well, and Inez, it's not just total denial. In a press conference just this week, they've actually started chalking the videos up to deepfakes, AI deepfakes. And so now the White House claim is that these aren't real videos of Joe Biden that are circulating every week or a couple of times a week, depending on how public he is. But these are deepfakes that Trump world, that the conservative media, that right-wing infiltrators are promoting to try to make him seem old and unstable. And so that particular tactic seems very concerning to me, because what does the claim of like unregulated AI deepfakes lead to? It leads to an overreach of the federal government controlling social media and controlling access to information going into the election. So that new line that they're using to try to sway attention off of Joe Biden by directly claiming that people are like subverting the election, that seems deeply concerning to me, because it opens the door to a host of other regulations or claims, and frankly just like adds more uncertainty to the conversation. And that seems to be the goal, is just like deny and make it uncertain, make people question what they believe, and then when they're uncertain of what to believe, provide them with a comforting, compelling narrative that they can buy onto, that Joe Biden's just a nice old man fighting for the American values, and then you can move from there.
It's actually almost worse than deepfakes, though, because they've used a different phrase, which is cheap fakes, which I think is just like videos that you don't like. So they're almost trying to straddle the line between alleging that the videos are AI generated and that they're like edited in some deceptive manner, I guess is what they're suggesting with the term cheap fakes. I had never heard this before, but that was what Karine Jean-Pierre offered during that White House press briefing yesterday. And again, it's like, okay, what is a cheap fake? It's, again, a video that you don't like. But in terms of how this is going to affect the election, there was a new poll that came out this week from Echelon Insights that was pretty fascinating. It actually asked voters if they were more concerned about Biden's age or Trump's felony conviction. And the majority of voters said that they were more concerned about Biden's age. And this is obviously consistent with polls that we've seen throughout the past couple of years, where something like 70 to 80% of voters believe that Biden is too old to be president. Now we have a direct comparison to perhaps the biggest criticism that the left is going to launch against the former president. And we see that their sort of calling card of being able to label Trump a convicted felon is probably not going to have as much impact on the election as they hoped it would.
Yeah, and for me, the thing that I think about is just what is the play here for the left, right? Is it to replace him at the convention or replace him prior to the election, or is it to hope he is reelected and then replace him after he takes office? Because I don't see how anyone on the left could think that the president, with this state of cognitive and, in some respects, physical decline, is going to make it through another 4-year term. So to me, I'm just asking myself, okay, what is it that Democrats think is the best way to address this? Trying to gaslight the American people into, not believing our own eyes when we see the videos is not going to work. I mean, I saw it in a video of him, at a recent Juneteenth event at the White House. He just was frozen, and it seems to be this is one of his default states, is just to freeze when there's a lot of activity going on. And the irony is that I think recently the president shared a proclamation bringing awareness to elder abuse, either day or week or month. And I thought to myself, I hope somebody in the White House is actually getting the memo. It sounded like a cry for help, quite honestly.
Yeah, it's interesting that to pick up on something that Emma said, there is this structure of debate. I don't even want to call it debate, but like discussions that I'm sure everybody in the audience and the four of us had with personal friends or acquaintances or people who disagree with us politically, right? And it is almost impossible to have a discussion, not only because the values are so far apart, but because as soon as you bring up something that is like obvious and in the public, like in terms of data, for example, about the lab leak and COVID, even things that the New York Times has now, in its glory of printing everything 5 years too late, right, is willing to accept. There's just this response. It's like, no, that's conspiracy theory. That's misinformation. And I'm wondering if they think they can push it this far, right? Something that is clearly a concern for a lot of voters, that if they just get all of their media voices in a row saying that this is a fake concern, that they will be able to get away with it. And I mean, my gut instinct is that the answer is no, because this is so kind of basic, because so many people have gone through this with a loved one, like they know what a person who is aging and losing cognitive ability and physical ability is, it looks like, but they have gotten away with this with so many things, like with enough people, or even if, I don't know, I'm sure you guys have had this experience, like talking to people who are not even like super left-wing, but let's say like independent, or they don't follow politics very much. And let's say that that's fake. Like it happens all the time, the cultural stuff about what material is that's actually in the schools, for example. People, it's so crazy that people don't believe it when you tell them, oh, like there's basically softcore porn in the schools. People don't believe that because their basis for reality doesn't really accept how far that's gone. I wonder if they think they can get away with the same thing here. There's the second point that I wanted to make about the importance of this issue. I know that the Joe Biden administration has been a disaster, especially from, you know, our perspective. But the fact that 90% of the government functions clearly without the direct supervision of the president is something worth pointing out repeatedly. I mean, listeners of this podcast know that already, that basically the structure of our government between the administrative state and the courts, it's largely bounds our politics, and really the president is relegated to making foreign policy decisions, for example, or, you know, pushing particular issues that he is interested in through the bureaucracy, successfully in the case of Joe Biden and unsuccessfully in the case of Trump, right? But the fact that so much of our government functions really should put to rest in a very final way the certain percentage of the right that still thinks that we function as a constitutional republic. We obviously don't, like, as a matter of political description, totally objective before we get to, you know, how terrible a thing that is. As a matter of describing the American system no longer functions as a constitutional republic. It functions as this kind of administrative body that actually does not need the direction from the elected president, the vast majority of things that it does day to day.
Yeah, this reminds me of the quote by George Orwell, speaking specifically to the part about his age and will the public buy it. But he says that, quote, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was the final, most essential command." And that seems to be the point we've reached here, where you're being asked to deny reality. You're being asked to deny the things that you see with your eyes, that intuition within your gut that says something's not right here and this shouldn't be normalized, has been normalized wherever in all of the mainstream media. Yeah, so that just is like the final like quote that just has stayed in my mind throughout this whole discussion.
We're going to kick it right back to you, Emma, to walk us through the latest legal harassment from the LGBT community against Masterpiece Cake Shop baker Jack Phillips.
Yes, so the slippery slope is indeed slippery. So most listeners will remember 2012 when Jack Phillips was asked to bake a wedding cake for a gay couple, or bake a cake celebrating a gay union. And he said no. And this, of course, resulted in the Supreme Court case on this point, which he was ultimately vindicated in. In the process, he was, of course, strewn through the mud, called a homophobe and everything else you can imagine, and really became the figurehead for the religious freedom movement and what it looks like to maintain your religious beliefs in a society that's continually, increasingly intolerant for anything that doesn't buy the love is love progressive woke ideology. And today, for the third time, he is back in court with the Colorado Supreme Court for another case. And now this time he was actually asked to bake a cake celebrating a gender transition. So it begins with gay marriage, quickly moves to transgenderism. And so again, he very politely declined. It was a pink cake on the outside, or a blue cake on the outside, a pink cake on the inside with, like, you know, some sort of celebratory language for gender transition. And so he is back in the Supreme Court to defend his free speech rights as a baker. And so there's a couple of things that have really stood out to me. The first is, as ADF has said, who's representing him, he serves all customers, right? This is not a decision because they are gay or because they're transgender. He serves all customers, but he, as a baker, as a citizen, has the constitutional free speech right to decide what message he promotes and what message he shares. And so based on the 303 creative precedent that was set in the Supreme Court last year, they're hoping to ensure once and for all that his free speech rights are protected, that he has the right to decide what message he promotes and can't be forced into it, basically. But one of the things that really stood out to me in this case was a World Magazine article written by an ADF legal expert. And she was talking about how Jack Phillips has really become this face of not only the movement, but of Christian witness and what it looks like to stand firm in your faith and values. So of course we have Lori Smith, the Colorado artist, who went to the Supreme Court last year over a very similar case, where they directly ruled in favor of her free speech. And that was the 303 creative case. And then there's also the instance of the woman in Alaska who ran a homeless shelter. And she was posed one day with this horrible on-the-spot decision where a man presenting as a woman asked to enter the women's shelter, and she denied him. And she says the first three words that came to her mind were, "Remember the baker." And Jack Phillips really serving as this this huge cultural encouragement for so many people who were put in these impossible or very difficult situations. And then finally, the artist pointed out Ayan Harisi Ali, I think I'm like horribly like mispronouncing her name, who was a Somalia-born human rights activist, author, podcast host, who was not a Christian, came to the US as an atheist. But she talks about how the story of Jack Phillips is what really woke her up and reminded her of this sort of totalitarian Islamic fundamentalism that she fled from. And so last year, she actually publicly announced that she had become a Christian, and that one of the main motivations in her conversion was the case of Jack Phillips. So as ridiculous as this ongoing court cases against Phillips have become, at the same time, I think we can truly see that the suffering that he's endured has borne really good fruit. And it continues to live on by providing the courage and strength other people need to stand against the sort of torrent of like the love is love, tolerant, progressive ideology. Yeah, so as we're like thinking about this, I think there's a lot of things that come to mind with like the role of the courts in protecting free speech. Are the courts still a useful path for conservatives to rely on? I know there's a lot of pushback on both sides on this question. The second is the question of religious liberty and free speech and what that looks like in a growing intolerance under the guise of tolerism or tolerance. And then, yeah, just like the culture war, social issues that come from that.
I think one of the first things that jumps out to me about this case and similar ones to it is that the left likes to say they want a separation of church and state, but I mean, their preferred religion tolerates no blasphemy, no apostasy, and they don't even tolerate dissent. So to me, we need a separation of pride and state, because it's at the point where we've gone far past, love is love, or particularly from a Christian perspective, hate the sin, love the sinner. We're far past tolerance. It's not even just affirmation, it's full on celebration, and anyone who does not bend the knee should expect to be treated in a similar manner. And I'm thinking of Dominique Galbraith, who is a dressmaker in New York, who refused to make a custom dress for a lesbian wedding, and had to suffer the penalty for that. Now, in her instance, I think what, for lack of a better term, aggravated the customers even more is the fact that she's a Black woman, and they tried to guilt trip her and say, hey, as a person of color, you should understand what it feels like to be discriminated against, and we are basically no different than you are. And one of the things that I take away from that is how sort of the rules of the road have, and sort of our political ecosystem has shifted over the last 60 years, to the extent that the LGBT movement, the Pride movement, has attached its car to the civil rights movement. And in many respects, Pride is the new Black. So I've said this before on social media, particularly the Black Christians who think that they're going to be spared the fate of Jack Phillips when they practice their faith in terms of whether it's a dressmaker or a caterer or a baker or creative, have to understand that if they ever get crossways, either with a trans person or two men who want to enter into a same-sex marriage, the NAACP is not going to have your back. And I think people should know that. And Jack Phillips is proof that this is where it's going in terms of total affirmation and celebration of pride.
Yeah, a couple points. One, people are connecting the various parts of the pride movement, right? It's not just the transgender piece of the LGBT. So if you look at it's really interesting to me, fascinating, maybe hopeful in some minor way, to look at polling on gay marriage, which has been consistently the story of polling on gay marriage has been consistently consolidating support since Obergefell, which I can never pronounce. You can't say Ion Hirsiali. I can't say Obergefell. Anyway, so it basically has been consolidating since then, even among Republicans, where you see like polls that show the majority of Republicans support gay marriage. It's the reason that the Republican Party was reluctant to take a vote, for example, even a symbolic vote in Congress that would take a stand against gay marriage, for example. It's just been one of these stories in politics where like this is a lost battle. I mean, this is becoming a tenet of our politics across the political spectrum, and being against it automatically puts you into a fringe category. Well, those polls are starting to change, and they're changing among the youngest voters. So it's not changing among even millennial generation, but it is changing among Gen Z. And probably the story of Gen Z is going to be that they are the highest percentage of them, up to 1 in 5, identify as LGBT. But they are also the first generation in the last, or the first time in the last close to 20, 25 years, where you're actually seeing declines, sometimes 11, 17% in some polls, declines in support for gay marriage, because whoever said the slippery slope is slippery, that argument just seems a lot stronger in in 2024 than it did back in 2008 when we were having these discussions. On the legal aspects of this is not just about religious liberty and free speech. If you categorize these cases, we have a real problem legally, and we're going to have to, I think, construct some legal doctrines around this of who has full free speech rights in terms of the corporate world. So you have cases on the one hand, like Jack Phillips, who is a single proprietor who does who sells a product that is sort of creative in nature, right? Like making a wedding dress, for example, might fall into the same category. And 303 Creative is wedding websites, right? There's this inherent sort of creative, artistic aspect to this. Plus, you're a single proprietor. It's not a massive company. It's usually one person, and there are plenty of alternative options for customers. Then somewhere in the middle, you might think about throwback to Hobby Lobby, right? Won its case about being a closely held company, held essentially by one Christian family, and wanting to keep the company in line with those values. But on the furthest reaches of this, we might want to reconsider whether corporations are people. When we look at the behavior of corporations like Google or Meta or Amazon, right, we can see that like Amazon exercising its free speech rights and determining which books can and can't be sold on Amazon Marketplace actually like has a market effect of shutting down the ability of people to disseminate their speech. And I think our courts should consider whether full free speech rights should attach like at each stage of this sort of corporate expansion. If you're a publicly traded company that doesn't have like a single proprietor or a single family that's asserting something that we can recognize as either religious liberty rights or free speech rights, is Jack Phillips' case comparable to Amazon? And my thought on that is no, it's not, for a variety of reasons. One of the most important among them is that the existence of viable market alternatives for people. Now that also to confuse it back with these issues back into the civil rights issues, that reminds me a lot of Heart of Atlanta and the right to travel, right? Like if you have every, whether it's through collusion politically or whether it's just through cultural choice, if you have virtually 80 or 90% of the market, let's say, of motels on Highway 10, right, running through the South, who decides we're not going to serve a particular class of customer, there's a real like problem that results from that quote unquote freedom of association or freedom of speech used by in a corporate sense. I don't know. I think these questions are actually really going to be very critical in the next 5 to 10 years in our legal system. And I think it's incumbent on us to think about all the ways to distinguish the Jack Phillips case from Amazon.
Yeah, I guess my closing remark as I move on to my segment, I think it does tie in is that the left, of course, really distills these cases down to broader themes about progressive ideals that don't really have anything to do with the actual legal aspects of them. So, for example, in Jack Phillips, it's, well, he's refusing to serve gay people. Or in the bump stock case, it's, we're just trying to keep kids from dying, right? And it's like, well, no, the bump stock case is about the fact that a unelected portion of the executive, an unelected agency in the executive, decided to reclassify guns equipped with bump stocks as machine guns. Like, no, you can't do that. And also, no, you can't force somebody to use their art to create a message that they fundamentally disagree with. But this is part of a larger game that they play of using the courts to do activism, which is part of this New York Times article I want to talk about, which details how the anti-Trump resistance is planning to hamstring a potential second Trump term. They are apparently already drafting lawsuits in an attempt to hold up any potential policies, particularly immigration-related policies that Trump might bring about in court. They're apparently stockpiling mifepristone pills, the abortion pill, and the article goes through basically all of the different players and organizations involved in this and all of the things that they supposedly learned from the first time around so that they can be prepared. And of course, there's an element here of anti-democracy from the supposedly protectors of democracy, in that they want to deny the opportunity of an executive who's duly elected by the people from implementing the policies that the people voted for him to enact. And the legal element of this is fascinating too when we put it in concert with the recent attacks on the Supreme Court, and particularly the conservative justices on the Supreme Court. You have Biden talking about basically the court being illegitimate because somebody flew an American flag upside down, Martha Ann Alito, Alito's wife. And then you have Democrat Senator Chris Murphy agreeing with that and saying that the court is in crisis. And it's because this is basically the only part of the legal system that the Democrats don't control at this point. And so they know that they're going to need the Supreme Court if Trump wins a second term. Even now, they're trying to get these conservative justices to recuse themselves to weigh in on to not be able to weigh in on cases related to January 6th and presidential immunity. They ultimately want to remove these conservative justices entirely. They're still upset that Hillary Clinton didn't win and that the court isn't a 6-3 liberal majority. And this is all really, I think, part of the same plan, which is very much to continue their institutional capture and make it impossible, even if the voters choose a different path than what they would like to have in America. They want to implement as many barriers as possible so that the voters don't get what they want, so that all of the institutions, whether legal, the executive branch, Congress, are all geared towards keeping the progressive march ongoing. So with that, I'll toss it to the group in terms of what you think the resistance is planning besides just filing a bunch of lawsuits against Trump. And if you think that there's probably part of this related to the voting system as we head into November as well. We saw a lot of last minute changes to voting laws, obviously, in 2020. And do we think they're going to try that again?
Yeah, I mean, this shouldn't come as a surprise, although reading this article to me, it just gives me this overwhelming sense of hopelessness because the right is nowhere near this organized, right? And they're just not. And actually, the one bright spot in this article is where they point to Texas and Florida and say, like, those agendas are actually have been very successful against what we want. So we have to, one, find ways to work against this, and two, like, duplicate this in our states, essentially. The fact that they're for once copying our tactics shows me that those actually, the state models in Florida and Texas are something that we should be doubling down on the right, and hopefully the pieces of it that are relevantly copied on the federal level, we should be doing on the federal level. And it shows that the more aggressive use of public policy and of government to promote conservative ends, and to roll back some of the institutional capture the left has managed to do, though they recognize that those things actually have hurt them in a way that a bunch of stuff that the right does has not. So, I mean, that was sort of the one bright spot for me here in reading what is essentially a much more organized, well-funded, and smart, frankly, sort of enemy than our own side. But, you know, it shouldn't be a surprise, because under the last Trump administration, we essentially got a 4-year lesson on the fact that all of the institutions within and outside of Washington, D.C. were going to oppose what are democratically backed, to Amber's point, changes in policy. I've used this point before, but we saw, you know, actual norms being broken, like generals circumventing the president on foreign policy, right? Those are very serious norms about civilian control of the military. For example, we saw intelligence agencies start to interfere in American elections, right? That's, again, very important norms that were broken. And then there was the stuff that didn't make the headlines because it wasn't about the, you know, the deep state coming after Trump or whatever. It was just the normal working of the bureaucracy. But that was organized as well. I remember in DC when the turnover happened in 2016, one of the first things after the election was that there was a series of workshops for federal employees who wanted to, quote unquote, you remember #resist, right? Federal who wanted to use their jobs to resist the policies of the Trump administration. They were conducting open to the public trainings in Washington, D.C. as to how to do that. So fortunately, you know, I do think there are some people on the right who are thinking about it this time around. They know that there's going to be administrative, essentially, warfare against them. That's why proposals like Schedule F to actually reschedule some of the highest ranking bureaucratic officers who are currently not considered, quote unquote, political, but who are absolutely acting as political agents, to reschedule them and to make them basically fireable the way that political appointees are. I think that probably has a lot of promise, but at the end of the day, that's a very small percentage of the bureaucracy. We have to think about the bureaucracy as having its own political ends, because it very clearly does. From when you look at their donations, it goes 95% to the Democratic Party. It very clearly has a political agenda. And that political agenda is not going to be, I mean, Trump or any future Republican who's elected is going to have to fight against his own government. And in order to do that smartly, we need a plan like what's laid out in the New York Times.
Yeah, I mean, for me, part of what I think about, particularly if Trump wins re-election over the next 4 years, is okay, what is the media landscape going to look like? And one of the things that I think, and this may work in conservatives' favor, just looking at some of the reaction to the most recent trial he had in New York, I've talked to a few people, and at a certain point, it's just like, wow, I didn't know what he was being charged with, and I didn't particularly care because I knew they had charged him, you know, with 600 different crimes, and after a certain point, the shock value of these things stops mattering as much because they're just so frequent. And I can't see any reason why the left wouldn't continue to do from 2024 on what it did in the first go round, which is to drum up any sort of story that they can find that paints Trump, his family, and the administration in a bad light. And I just wonder at a certain point whether the American people, not just conservative, but just even moderates, would just at a certain point say, I'm not really paying attention to any of this stuff anymore. I know you guys are going to write what you're going to write. CNN is going to say what it's going to say, and I'm completely checked out of the political process.
Yeah, and I think that probably wraps us up on this segment. So we're gonna finish right back to you, Delano, with your recent article with the Institute for Family Studies that talks about basically the cultural challenges that face conservatives as they're trying to sell their ideas to varying groups of people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's something to be said for the art of the culture war. All right. So I open with a quote from Sun Tzu about knowing your enemy, and why doing so is so imperative if you want to achieve victory. And I think one of the things that I see, this is primarily online, and this is primarily about rhetoric, even though it can also involve public policy, is conservatives who, in an attempt to, chop down the left And I'm thinking of the sort of stereotypical pink-haired, septum ring, gender studies major, radical second wave feminists, can sometimes, in the way that they speak about issues around marriage and family formation, end up hitting our own side. And one of the examples I use is like, you might have a 25-year-old woman who, just given her age, tends to share things on social media and share about her frustrations about not being able to find a suitable mate. And that's the type of thing where I see some conservatives mock and scorn and say, "Oh, you shouldn't have been a gender studies major." And she might turn around and say, "Look, I went to a Christian college, and I desire to be married and to have a family, but my male peers have no interest in getting married before the age of 30." And there are ways in which we talk about, again, a pro-marriage, pro-family, sort of pro-life agenda that can end up having that young woman feel as if she's collateral damage in our culture war. So, and the same thing applies to men, right? There's some young men who say, "I'm not thinking about a wife and kids right now," and it's not because they've been, influenced by Andrew Tate. It's because, like I was in my mid-20s, I didn't have stable employment. I didn't have, stable transportation. I didn't have stable lodging. So it's one of those things where I think we just need to think well about how we frame our issues. I'm not suggesting that we change our priorities in any way, shape, or form. It's just about being mindful that when we start to shoot our weapons, that there may be some people who we hit that we don't intend to. So I'll throw that open to the rest of the group.
There was a really controversial article that was written a couple of years ago where a woman said, "I got married at 23. What's wrong with you?" And she made an entire case for get married young. We value the family. We value children. I can't wait to, primarily stay at home while my husband pursues his career. And as you can imagine, it like caused a massive backlash. And she, I think, was in the best of intentions trying to make a point about prioritize marriage, don't fall into the career trap, young women. But to your point, Delano, right? Like that ends up having the worst possible impact, especially on so many young women who would love to get married. I mean, like most of my friends here in DC are in their 20s or early 30s. A lot of them aren't married yet. And it's not because they don't want to, right? Like they go to church, they're a part of these social groups, they have good values, they're attractive, right? And so I think the moment we make the conversation like weirdly focused on like, why haven't you gotten married? What's wrong with you? We end up sort of, it becomes like this weird inorganic thing where everyone looks at everyone like a potential partner and it makes all the like conversations really weird. I don't know. We need to like promote just like being normal and like generally having the right values and like prioritizing these things, but don't become like on the one hand, the like over intentional person who like meets a person and is like, could they be my potential spouse? They check off all three of these things I look for, but I really hate the way they wear their hair. Like it just gets really weird fast. But something that I also really liked in your article, Donna, is that you talked about how this is not just that it can't just be something that people who are married or do have children should promote, right? Like conservatives who don't have children, who aren't married, who, maybe have divorces or like a less ideal past. Like this shouldn't be something that only those who like point to their personal life endorse, but this should be something that the good is recognized for society. And this is the ideal that we uphold with the recognition that like very few people fit some quote unquote ideal that certain people have, right? That like we need to promote like a cultural vision and then recognize that people will find their place within that at different times. And then I think the thing that like I'm really curious about, Delano, is like who's the enemy, right? Schmidt talks about the friend enemy distinction. And so who should we call the enemy? Is it the like brainwashed left-wing liberals, feminists, right, at college campuses who have probably are as much the victim as they are the perpetuators of this stigma? Can we simply blame it on some like ideal that like college professors have taught? And frankly, I think in a lot of cases, I think it comes down to mothers and grandmothers. And so there's this really interesting trend of feminism for thee, but not for me, where you see women, and I hear this all the time from friends, where their mothers and grandmothers chose a very traditional path and then look at their daughters and they're like, well, just delay marriage. Like, don't worry about that now. Like, you need to choose what's best for you, choose what's best for your career, like make the most of it. Like, I couldn't go out and I love staying home and you're amazing, but like you should just take your time. You have plenty of time for all of these things. And I think like even in like the best, even when meant the best, it ends up having this like perverse influence on our generation where like even conservative mothers and grandmothers are encouraging their daughters to delay marriage and delay family, and maybe do the things they couldn't do. And frankly, that seems like a far more interesting subculture to consider, of like, how do you actually influence those people to maybe present like a more nuanced depiction of like marriage and family?
Look, it's definitely hard to add any individualism and nuance into the sex wars that seem to become more cyclical and like sort of progressively ridiculous and caricatured online. That being said, I think there are, like, if you look at the data underlying, there's a reason that those somewhat caricatured views spring up, right? We know that there's a higher and higher percentage of men who are hitting 30 without ever having sex. We know that people are forming families later in life, if at all. We know that the millennial generation will have the highest proportion in recorded history of women hitting 45 unmarried and childless. That those will all have massive impacts on our politics, right? Not to mention the perpetuation of our civilization. So, I mean, we do live under a tyranny of exceptions. And so my instinct with a lot of this stuff is to say, well, if it's not about you, then just move on, right? Like if this article doesn't apply to you for whatever reason, like why do we have this knee-jerk reaction to say, well, you can't point out these general trends in society because it might hurt someone's feelings who it doesn't apply to. Any actual serious consideration of these things always considers there's always been a role, for example, for unmarried women in society, right? And not just the monastery. I'm talking about like in society. This is not a new phenomenon. Not everybody got married in 1953 either, right? So, how to talk to people respectfully and is one thing, but I do get annoyed by this sort of knee-jerk tyranny of exceptions thing, where it's like, well, that doesn't apply to me, therefore don't say it. Don't observe these true facts about our general society, right? On the other hand, we are now moving into a situation where those exceptions, what were once exceptions, are now the norm. So where we have like, there is a tipping point, for example, in family formation, where out of wedlock births go from something that is culturally recognized as a bad thing, but nevertheless happens in relatively high numbers, right? Because life is messy and things happen. And there is like an actual, and I can't recall what percentage, or maybe there hasn't been the actual statistical work done to nail it down to a particular percentage, but there is a lot of social science work around what happens when, for example, being born out of wedlock and not having a married father in the home goes from a culturally perceived mistake or tragedy to where it becomes the norm. And there's this additional, so it's not just the individual who then is missing a married father, right, in the home, it just becomes the norm. And the whole concept of being a married father disappears from the community as like the ideal that one should strive towards. And I think that's what's happening with a lot of these things, where when you're not just talking about exceptions, when you're talking about huge percentages, for example, to bring it to millennial women, huge percentages of women who will likely be single and childless, for their lives, for the rest of their lives. Like this is going to be very, very difficult to convince people, not on the individual level, but on the societal level, about the value of sort of conservative values surrounding the family, when you now have a third generation, in many cases, of people who are coming from divorced families or coming from broken families in different ways. Like the ideal is no longer tangible to them. They have never observed it in their own lives and their families' lives. And this does trace back to the 60s and the sexual revolution and the explosion of divorce among boomers. That's what I hear the most, actually. Emma has her anecdotal stories from her friends. What I hear the most from like millennials is the fear of getting married because their parents divorced nastily. And so when you're already on the third generation, those exceptions move to being the norm. It's kind of like, I think for like, probably for white America, the divorce boom is probably the equivalent of the Moynihan report for the Black community about out of wedlock births in the 1960s and 70s, right? Like that this has become the norm for families to be broken in this way, and it has generational cascading consequences that are really, really difficult to overcome with political messaging. I'm not saying I'm just saying like political messaging around this stuff is just the ideal doesn't seem real and tangible to a lot of people, whether it's because it's, a 30-year-old incel or it's because you're already the third generation of divorced and messy and recombined families.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, and I think that's like the importance of Delano's article, which is that there's so many elements to this and so many different reactions that you might get by even just stating sort of obvious generalities. Delano, you talk about the Harrison Bucker speech a little bit towards the end of your article. And I had a conversation at a dinner recently where we were talking about our reactions to it. And I just was like, I think it's really being blown out of proportion, considering married women with children are the happiest cohort of all women in America. Most women still say that they want to get married and have children. This is not some like strange anomaly. And there was a woman at the table who was like, well, I'm 40 and I'm not married and I don't have kids and I'm really happy. And I'm like, okay, great. Then you're really happy. And like, this doesn't apply to you. I mean, it's really difficult to even just say, basic things like that when people do take things very personally. But at the same time, like Emma, your point's important too, because when our rhetoric is aimed at blaming individuals for choices that they make, which is obviously valid, it can sometimes take the conversation away from blaming the larger cultural and societal trends that have led us to this. And sometimes people kind of get trapped in all of these other external factors that are causing people to get married later, to have fewer children. And we're out of time there, but we are going to go to final thoughts, and I'm going to kick it to Delano first.
Sure. I mean, you guys gave me a perfect opportunity for an alley-oop because, with my final thoughts, I just want to press even further on this issue of family. One thing I will say is this: I do think, and particularly as a man, it's incumbent to speak more about the decisions that young men make and don't make when it comes to these things. Because one of the issues, again, when you're talking about marriage, is that every traditionalist expects a man to propose to a woman. So it's not as if women feel like, okay, well, if he's not proposing to me, let me go out on a hunt and find a good mate and lock him down. So there is something to be said about the decisions that young men make. But Inez was 100% spot on, right? I'm thinking about the fake controversy with Representative Byron Donalds when he said that the Black family was together during the Jim Crow era, and holding that and looking at the media's reaction to that compared to the announcement in People magazine that Ebony K. Williams, who is a lawyer and a television host and an alumna of Real Housewives of New York, unmarried, but anyway, announcing that she is having a baby at 40 via IVF, and she is proud to be single by choice. And I think what we see is that the American family is at a crossroads. And unfortunately, much of this is sort of partisan and ideological, where the right still says, imperfect as it may be, or infrequently as they may be, that every child deserves a married mom and a dad, and that fathers actually do play an important role in their homes. And the left says, well, reproductive technology has advanced to such a point that women can and sometimes should have children without the benefits of a husband. And really, as long as she has enough resources, the child won't suffer. So I don't think that second one is a good place to be, but I think we do need to think more and talk more about these things because this is going to determine the future of our country.
Yeah. Final thoughts. Trust what your eyes and your ears see. Trust your intuition when it comes into assessing everything from the political to the cultural realm. If it doesn't sit right, There's wisdom in that repugnance, as Leon Cass says. Two, on Jack Phillips, I think this is an incredible, with like keeping in mind like the Trump resistance article and discussion that Amber let us in, right? Like, I think this is just a really an encouraging time to remember like that, to stand strong, to be firm in what you believe, and that like even in suffering, right, that like good things come from that, and your suffering is never for naught. There is always a purpose behind it, and that can sound like a sort of like blithe cliche, but there's, I think, like a very deep spiritual truth to that, that sustains us through these much harder periods, where it feels like you're just constantly fighting and constantly being fought against, even in the very reasonable, very good things that you're trying to do. And then final point on Delano's, my deeply politically incorrect statement for today is, if you as a society focus on creating strong men, strong women will follow. If you focus on creating strong, independent women, you get weak men and societal decline. And I think it in some ways really is that simple in how we frame our education, our cultural values, and the way that we form good men and women.
So my final thought is actually more directly political, which is we have more evidence of the theory that I've been floating for a while on this podcast, which is that we are seeing a reversal between the parties as to who has the more reliable voting bloc and who's going to benefit from mass turnout elections. So the political standard for the last 30 plus, probably longer years has been, this is why Democrats are always, interested in expanding the franchise and making it easier to vote, even, if that lets in fraud, perhaps because it lets in fraud. We'll leave that aside for now. But generally, even leaving aside fraud, the Democratic Party has wanted more and more people to vote, because generally in high turnout elections, Democrats overperformed and Republicans tended to lose, whereas Republicans tended to overperform in midterm elections, in special elections where, you have people who are the most dedicated to participating in the political process, whether that's because they're older voters who are take it as a civic duty and have the time and sort of focus on it to consistently turn out in the polls, or because just attachment to the institutions. And I think just as we've seen conservatism as an ideology or as a life philosophy grapple with the fact that institutionalism and supporting the institutions has now become a feature of the left rather than the right. Now what we're seeing is actually unattached voters coming out, specifically, it's probably too early to say that for the Republican Party, but for Trump, right? So there's been a series of polling on that. One of the categories that Joe Biden is actually overperforming within is old voters, right? So actually older voters are breaking more for Biden. Now, older voters still vote Republican, to be clear, right? But they are breaking in higher percentages for Biden than they have in past elections. And on the other hand, Trump is winning polls by 14 points among voters who have never voted before. Which did not used to be the dynamic of the two parties. So this is going to present a lot of challenges to the Republican Party politically, right? Because there's a reason that people who are more attached to the institutions, they are more reliable voters. They are more likely to actually show up on election day or, election week or month, as the case may be now, and mail in their mail-in ballots, right? It'll be interesting to see what happens to the voter ID conversation, what happens to the voter security conversation in the next, decade or whatever, as these incentives flip, where like the Republican Party actually wants mass voting, right? And the Democratic Party wants limited or restricted voting of just the institutionalists. But I don't know. I think it's an interesting development in politics. It's definitely going to affect this upcoming election. I suspect it's going to continue to affect, 2028 going forward. It's just one of those. It is a good reminder that the truisms of politics change over time, just like the swing states that everybody, the electoral college conversation. Why do we always have an election that focuses around, Iowa, Ohio and Florida, right? We're sick of catering to those three states. Well, now Ohio and Florida and Iowa, actually all three of them are all basically leaning pretty strongly Republican. And we have new swing states, Georgia, which was not a swing state, right? Arizona, which was not a swing state. So these things are not actually static facts of life. Politics changes, and the underlying assumptions of politics and American politics change.
All close us out with a little bit of optimism. Inez mentioned earlier the cultural swing of Gen Z. And I think this is really important because when we see polling on the cultural attitudes of Gen Z, we actually see that from 2021 to 2023, they were the only generation that saw support for same-sex marriage decrease as opposed to increase. It fell from 80% to 69%. And we also see a 14% increase in the percentage of Gen Z that says there are only two genders. And I think it's a great reminder that the excesses of the left will spark pushback from sane and reasonable people, and certainly people who are willing to be independent-minded and free-thinking. And sometimes it's as simple as that, and we really don't have to overthink too much when things seem crazier than ever. People who just have a modicum of sense are going to naturally gravitate towards the alternative. That's going to do it for us this week. On behalf of Delano, Inez, and Emma, I'm Amber Duke. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.